Yes.
Okay. Welcome everyone. We are here at Addison County Regional Planning. We have Danelle Byron and Rebecca Elder, ace computer techs. Adam Luigi, myself, Katie Raycroft-Meyer, and the Housing Committee members. I've got Herb on screen. I introduced the people here that you don't see: Tim Davis, Tom Perry, Nick and Shannon. They don't have last names. So, and thank you for everyone for being here. So, the presentation, can you go to the first one? Yep. To the basically, we're going to do a preview of or a review of Act 181 and talk about the future land use mapping process that we'll be doing at Addison County Regional Planning and working with municipalities. The presentation is broken down into 3 sections, and at the end of each section, we're going to have a time for questions. So if you can hold your questions to those points, that would be great. And we're going to move to slide 2. So just a general overview of Act 181, which you can be viewed as a Act 250 reform bill. And basically the intent of this is to, it was to create a new framework for Act 250 and land use planning in Vermont. This act still, Act 250 still, Act 181 basically still promotes the principal state goal of planning development so as to maintain historic settlements, pattern of compact village and urban centers separated by rural countryside. Okay, next slide. What? Next slide.
I'm trying to get rid of
Yeah, that was the next slide. Okay. Trying to get rid of that thing. Okay. Yeah. So this is probably the most complicated slide of the slide deck, but it kind of outlines what we are hearing about the tiers. So Act 181 basically changes Act 250 from a project-based jurisdiction to, when I say it changes Act 250 review from a project-based jurisdiction to a location-based jurisdiction. Act 250 review is triggered by location as opposed to the type or size of the project. The new jurisdiction areas are referred to as tiers, and where possible, these tiers will align with regional and local land use maps. Basically, the goal of this, another goal is to encourage development in existing or planned growth areas by providing Act 250 exemptions in those areas. I think I'm going to move to the next slide unless people want a little more description of tiers at this point.
I'm not seeing the slides. Is anyone else seeing the slides?
I see the slides.
Yeah, I'm seeing them. I see slide 3 of 26.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to do a brief definition. Did someone have a brief definition of the tiers? Actually, we should just go back. So tier 1 is looking at growth areas. Tier 3 is looking at areas that have more critical natural resources, but specifically it has the guidance hasn't been fully developed for tier 3, and tier 2 is everything else. And I have a hard time with that definition, but it is kind of what doesn't fit into tier 1, and tier 1 is broken down to tier 1A and 1B, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. What's not in tier 1 and what's not in tier 3 is in tier 2. So tier 2 covers a lot of different areas of land use. Okay, next slide. So in addition, Act 181 requires all planning commissions to create new future land use maps using a consistent future land use area, which is referred to as a FLUA in this presentation. So we're looking at consistent land use areas and consistent terminology throughout our region and throughout the state. RPCs will work with their municipalities to coordinate this process of us developing these maps. And the new future land use maps will be used to determine these Act 250 exempt areas, specifically Tier 1 and Tier B status. And okay, and the last point on here is Act 250, Act 181 also developed in that process, along with the Home Act of 2023, regional housing targets were developed. And during this mapping process, we're going to look at how we would disaggregate these housing targets per community, per municipality, based on these growth areas. Next slide. So the housing targets. So as I said, these housing targets were sort of derived from the these two acts, plus the Vermont Housing Needs Assessment, statewide housing needs assessment that was done in 25, last year, actually, excuse me. Some of the targets, there was a short-term target and a longer-term target. And these targets were developed looking at past growth rates in households. The lower end of the 2025 to 2030 targets was based on 2016 to 2019 household increases, and the higher end was based on 2019 to 2022. The longer range targets were developed more based on population projections and well, it was just more focused on population projections. I did put the housing needs assessment information on the bottom of this slide. There's a lot in that document, and we are going to be working on this later in the process, but it's definitely a piece of this project. So next slide. Okay, so who makes the decisions? When updating these maps, we will work with each community after this sort of kickoff presentation. We're going to develop a schedule and meet with each town, each planning commission, probably try to do a group meeting with select board and planning commission, and look at your land use plans and develop our regional land use plans based on that. Municipalities and select boards will then, well, actually, each community will be asked if they want to opt into new Act 250 exemptions based on this land use planning.
Sorry,
And that's going to be,
sorry.
that's all right. Okay, we're almost at the question section. What, you can't go back?
I just can't find your mouse. I could go back. This one?
Yeah, get rid of that.
I'm trying to.
Okay.
I'm trying to, it's just the.
Yeah, it's,
There it is.
so, okay.
It's the mouse.
So, back to who makes the decisions. We will be working as in County Regional Planning, we're working with the towns to develop the maps. The towns will then have the option to opt into this, to receive Act 250 exemptions. And then also the state, there'll be a new state land use review board that will be reviewing our plans, the regional plans. So all these things, there'll be multiple people making these decisions. It's not going to be a top-down decision. It's going to be a, you know, working with consensus and collaboration between multiple groups. Okay, the next slide. A little down arrow, just the arrow.
Yep, that's what I've been using this whole time.
Okay.
I was just there.
Okay. We're trying to advance the slide.
Oh, there you go.
Okay, so what this mapping process will not do is it will not impact existing zoning regulations. Some towns, well, many towns, small towns have similar planning areas to zoning districts. But new planning areas will not affect any of the zoning, basically the zoning that is below those planning areas. I mean, they'll be separate entities, although they may line up the same. This mapping process won't eliminate or change any existing village or downtown designation benefits. And it won't restrict development where it is currently allowed. And what are some of the benefits for opting in? State designation benefits for village and downtown centers that don't have them will gain that if they opt into the tier 1A and 1B areas. Exemptions from Act 250 within newly defined village areas and planned growth areas. Next. Questions? Yes.
Couple of questions. One for the tier 3 guidelines that are not been developed yet.
Mhm.
Who's developing them?
Okay, I have a slide at the end of the next section. And, well, you want to speak to that, Adam?
The state land use board. So the newly formed state land use board will be basically making the guidelines for tier 3.
But with input from others.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Yes.
They will have to go through a public process as well, but they will ultimately be in charge of creating
Right.
them.
And that's not going to be completed until February, until a year from now, correct? That's what
Probably.
yeah. Okay,
They're just formed.
right.
I think Caroline Paskey had a question. She's online.
Yeah, we have a few.
She's got a few hands back there too.
Okay, then they could just,
I'll get the people in the room, then I'll get the people online.
Perfect.
Susan?
Could you expand on the, on slide 6 under the municipalities eligible for tier 1 status apply directly to the LURD?
Can I get to that in this next section?
Mhm.
I'll apply to, okay. Rebecca, do you want to read the questions?
Carolyn, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Sorry, I have a screaming toddler in the background. So my question, I actually have two questions, and you might be answering the second one later. But one question just for mapping, I'm curious how hazards are being integrated and considered in that mapping effort in terms of, identifying good places for housing development. And my second question was, opting in is really scary. How much control does the town still have over what that development looks like after they opt in? I mean, are they saying you can put a giant multi-apartment building here, or can you determine that you want row housing or some kind of cluster development? How much control does the town still have over that? And will you help us with, anything that we need to do to protect the character of our community?
Okay, so the answer to the first question is, I'm going to touch on that when we get into the specific designations. But then the second question about opting in is, so the towns that opt into, their opt-in is only for tier 1B, and it's specifically for housing for 50 units per 10 acres. Now, the idea is that this will be giving the town local control, but you will still have, your systems for reviewing projects, but the Addison County Regional Planning can back you up in that process. So it would go through your DRB review. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, somewhat. I think I'll continue to learn more, but just the opting in, it seems intimidating, like you're just opening up the door to like kind of losing the regular review process, but I just wanted to understand that a
Well,
little bit better.
Yeah, Adam is gonna chime in here.
Hi, Caroline. So first, we are going to be creating our regional land use map, our future land use map by going out to all of your municipalities. So after this meeting, this is an introductory meeting. We're going to go to every planning commission in Addison County, and we're gonna meet with you. Katie will show you where we're starting, but we're gonna really start with your existing plans. And then apply the methodology there. So we intend to work with, hand in hand with you as best we can. To make sure that our plan reflects a lot of local knowledge. One of the benefits of this is, if you think of your village center, basically the tier 1B primarily in Addison County will basically expand to what everybody thinks of as their village. It won't just be a small area of their village. It'll expand to what people think of it, and then maybe a little outside of that for housing, depending on soils that you have, and some other things. And as Katie said, this doesn't affect your zoning. Your process will still be in place. So anything that comes before you, you'll have the same review process. What it does do is exempts housing from Act 250. So it provides some permit relief for putting housing within these village areas. Did that help any more, Carolyn?
Yeah, and like you said, there's going to be so much more conversation on this. But after you opt in, then you start having some more in-depth conversations, and all of our existing protections are in place. I think my answers, my question's answered. Yeah.
See this before you opt in.
Yeah, you don't have to, you can see what we're talking about before you opt in and
Okay.
see what that would entail. And I'm gonna show some examples of, the sort of the range of the size of the area that we're talking about for another town.
All right, great. Thank you.
Yeah, are there other questions? Oh, Herb.
Yeah. So I just want to expand a little bit on what Katie and Adam were saying. And as they said, so depending on, what your situation is in the town, some people might be a little, worried about, some state agency is going to draw tier 3 boundaries and stuff, and, the forested area and that kind of thing. I have the misfortune or fortune to be over in Montpelier these days, representing my district. And that process is really just starting. I was able to talk to the new chair of the Land Use Review Board, and they confirmed that they were just starting this out. And I was kind of heartened to hear that they're going to form a group to help them advise them around tier 3, so that they could be attentive to some of the concerns that folks in some of the rural areas might have. So number one, following up what Katie and Adam says, it's just started. Number two, I'm hopeful that they have some process that I think the regional planning commissions can really help with, to advise them on how those tier 3 boundaries might be established. Thanks.
Thanks, Herb. Other
Ready?
questions? And Susan, you were interested in tier 1A. I guess I'm going to jump back to that just briefly. Tier 1A has sort of more requirements than tier 1B. And there's probably just a few areas in Addison County that would be eligible and then want to apply for tier 1A. And that would probably, be Middlebury, Surrounds, and Virgins. The requirements are greater, and it will give them a greater exemption for Act 250 as well. But that's kind of something that, we wouldn't be as involved with, but it'd be more the municipality. Does that help? A little. I do have, what? No, sorry, I can share with you some other information on that later if you want. Okay. All right. Are we good with questions, Rebecca? Okay.
Okay,
Yep.
moving on.
Okay, so actually, on the last one, so where are we now? So in June, who created the DHCD, I think, created this map, correct? And
Yes.
so for the whole state, they developed a interim Act 250 exemption map. And here is a piece from Addison County. And the way they did this was to take all of the existing designations, state designations, village designation, and downtown designation. Here you can see Middlebury is orange. We have East Middlebury, Cornwall, Shoreham, Salisbury. And those were existing at the time. And they all have a buffer around them that indicates either a quarter mile or a half mile with the downtown districts. And within that buffer, those areas are now exempt from Act 250 for housing in the villages, for housing of 50 units per 10 acres. The next map. So, and then this will expire in January 1st, 2027. So this is just another section of Addison County.
Continue.
So these communities do not have to opt in for this. This is what's interim now. And in some cases, development has taken advantage of, developers have taken advantage and are working, have used this exemption. So,
Continue.
yep. The slide. So I did not develop this slide, but I think this is a good slide. So on the left-hand side is a list of the new land use area terminology districts and then the terminology for them. The graphic shows the new land use categories across the top horizontally. You have tier 1A, tier 1B, tier 1A downtown well, actually it's not tier 1, excuse me. These are back up a little bit. These are the land use categories. Downtown centers, village centers, planned growth areas, village areas, transitional, enterprise, resource-based recreation, hamlet, and then 3 rural districts, general, ag, forest, and conservation. The second horizontal line indicates what kind of state designation these areas can acquire. The centers are something that we're already familiar with when we have downtown designation or village center designation. Neighborhood is a little bit new. We have some NDAs, which are called neighborhood development areas, but that designation is something that towns can work towards. And then in terms of review, Act 250 review, you can see if towns either apply for tier 1, they get a full exemption for their downtown village center or planned growth areas, but that has to be, there's a lot of requirements that need to be met. And then tier 1B, you get the partial exemption, which is this 50 units per 10 acres. And that is available for downtown centers, village centers, a planned growth area, and a village area. I'm gonna go, the next few slides are gonna go through and give a description of all these different land use areas. So,
Ready?
Yep.
You know, what a swing there in Kansas City for sure.
Okay, we've got a mute.
I can't even control.
Okay.
Rebecca, could you mute all again? Thank you.
So Village Center, here's an example of Whiting. They just recently got their Village Center designation. So a Village Center or downtown center, could be Bristol. They are, classic mixed-use centers that have multiple assets to them. They So this includes all existing village and new town centers and downtowns. We don't really have any new town centers in Addison County. This also include, so this, I'm off my script. So, all right, so basically this is a description. I won't read everything here, but these are the village centers that we know, and this is something that is not required to have zoning, subdivision, or infrastructure, although all of our towns in Addison County do have zoning and subdivision regs. Next. So this is I didn't darken the draft. I'm sorry, I forgot to do that. This is a draft map. It's very important. So this is one of the new maps that we have developed for this presentation. So everything we've done, you're going to see. And this is Virgins, and this is looking at Virgins using the new methodology of mapping out their downtown center and then their growth area around that. And and this is what would be called a planned growth area. Requirements for a planned growth area are infrastructure. So they have wastewater, and another component that is required is what's called complete streets. And that basically means you have to be able to walk on a sidewalk or a decent path to get from your home to amenities. You can't, we need to have walkable communities. If your community isn't walkable, it doesn't meet. Complete streets I feel is pretty loose, but you have to be able to move around and get to the places you need to get to. Interesting thing about this map diagram is that the planned growth area for Virgins does go into Ferrisburgh and into Waltham. So that's a conversation that we need to have with Virgins and Waltham and Ferrisburgh. So how do we deal with that? Because the idea of this whole new program is, or whole new framework is, to be more regional. Next, yeah. Village area. So village area is pretty straightforward. You have that initial village designation. But if your town does not have a village designation, that village itself gets mapped, and then a village area of quarter mile out from that is delineated. Now, in this case, it's not just a circle around the center, it's actually looking at parcel lines and what makes sense. So you try to keep the same square mileage or footage, but have it located in places that make sense for development. We just did this as an exercise. We did not meet with Addison when we developed this. So when we do meet with Addison, we'll look at these parcels and do these parcels make sense? Do we need to shift it here or there? And getting to, I think, Caroline's question, how do you deal with hazards? If there was an area that had a flood hazard through here, that would not be considered. You would take that out of the village area, the planned growth area, because you wouldn't propose housing in that area. Next. One more thing about here, village areas are not required to have, they're not required to have water or wastewater. But you need to have land that could be used. It could be suitable for wastewater. Good. Yep. A transition and infill area, and Adam, you can help me on this one a little bit. Think of Route 7, think Route 116 maybe, where you have a mix of commercial and housing existing, and you want to work towards keeping it from being, developing it so that it is not strip, but a strip development, but try to plan for a well-planned area for housing and commercial mix. Next, yeah. Some other areas that that are listed there, the enterprise, which is, you know, it is a kind of, think of it maybe as industry or business park, airport, rail facilities. Not affiliated with housing, but it might. I'm just thinking about in Bristol, maybe the business park there, although that whole business park is in the plant, you know, in the village center area. But if that was separated, that might be considered an enterprise area. Hamlets are mapped in these plans. Hamlets are basically just a dot on the map. That's the Goshen Town Hall. And it is basically considered in a rural area, so. Resource-based recreation areas. And this is, maybe you can talk about this one too, Adam, but these were developed across the state. An obvious resource-based recreation area would be a ski resort, perhaps a large, like Basin Harbor Club is one that we refer to, you know, think of in our community, in our area. But we also have a lot of lakeshore, that is, you know, we have a higher density of housing there due to the lake. And if you want to follow up on that a little bit.
Sure. I would tell you, don't be afraid of this terminology. You know, as you look around the county or you look around the state, we had all sorts of language, basically. So a rural area could have meant a 5-acre area in one place and a 40-acre area in another place. What this language is trying to do is make it so that everybody can talk to one another in the same language. So that's where these come from. You already have them. You just might call them different things in your towns. And we're trying to get to some unified language where we can all kind of talk to one another and mean the same thing. So that's really what these different definitions were about. In order to get to unified language, we had to make some bigger assumptions, right? An enterprise or a quarry there, and we certainly have some quarries in Addison County. It shouldn't just be rural general. There's some special zoning that towns have basically in some of these industrial areas. So we wanted to recognize that. For the resource-based recreation, it's the same thing. They're not just rural areas, you get more different uses and more density a lot of the time. So like along the lake shore or, you know, we don't necessarily, well, no, actually the Snow Bowl is in the next Hancock.
Oops.
Or Granville, Hancock. So.
You're right. I thought, okay, it's not the symbol.
I thought it was on this side of the hill.
No, I know that it's in Hancock. I don't know what I was thinking.
Yeah.
It's just
But
the
anyway,
Middlebury Snow
You know,
Bowl.
there are lots of places where there are ski resorts. Again, it falls within tier 2, so it's still subject to Act 250. But we wanted to acknowledge that there were zones built around some of these areas. So that's how we arrived at all these 10 pieces of terminology.
Thanks. And then the 3 rural definitions, one being general. So I guess the best way to look at that is kind of like the landscape that has low density housing development. But it still has natural areas and productive lands and, but it's, you know, it's an area that has been settled. Agricultural and forestry is more of a working landscape, working farms and working forestry, and then conservation areas that tend to be conserved, that are more sensitive, that have ecological importance. So here's the tier 3 slide, which we've talked about somewhat. And a couple important points about this is, you know, as was mentioned before, the guidance and Herb mentioned this as well, is going to be developed by the Land Use Review Board. These areas are not based on current regional land use maps, but they will be in further renditions of those. And these areas are not defined by the rural conservation land use definition that was talked about on the previous slide. Okay. Next. Questions?
Just a quick question for clarification. You showed those quarter-mile bubbles around villages on one of the maps. And talked about those areas being exempt. They're exempt once those maps have been refined, is that correct?
No, those are existing interim maps that were developed this summer after this law went into. And they're to be, they're exempt now until the new land use maps are completed.
Created. So
Yeah.
the legislature wanted to, we have a housing crisis. They wanted to address housing immediately, really. So the interim exemption was a way to do that while we worked on these new future land use maps. So like Katie said, they were based on existing villages. The exemption is for housing. Right? It's for housing units and it's a specified number of housing units.
But they're still subject to flood hazard, septic requirements. all that
Absolutely.
kind of stuff.
Yes.
Mhm.
And they'll become more refined as this process goes on and you guys have a chance to meet with the individual municipalities, right?
So I think so Addison, you saw on the interim map, just had a pink bubble around it. But then I showed you, that was added, the village area that I showed, that was Addison. With using the methodology that we have to develop the future.
Mhm.
And it was, you know, it was more precise, looking at parcels. It will be and looking at hazards and that sort of thing. There weren't any in that Addison example, but there could have been.
And I think it's important to note that those existing areas already earned those designations.
Right,
Not like
right.
the state went in and said, oh, let's do this
Right.
here. So that municipality was already involved in that decision-making process.
Right. And, that just happened to work out for those towns. Some of those towns might have had plans in the works to do something, like Middlebury, for example. Definitely benefited from this, moving forward with the stone crop. I can't think of any offhand, any other ones, but there have been across the state.
For Jen's head.
Oh, right, okay. So, any other questions?
What does it mean in slide 18 to say that this tier 3 is not defined by new rural conservation land areas? What's the distinction? What's going to be the distinction?
Well, we don't know yet. So there is a methodology to map the conservation area, rural area now. It's not, and this is, Hannah would be able to answer this better than, but when you look at the rural area, there's the current use area, which means it's being used as either for forestry or farming, or so that would go into the ag and forest rural areas, state forests, those sort of things would be in the conservation for the planning areas. Tier 3 is going to have yet another sort of clarification of guidance that has not been developed yet. It is probably going to align in many ways with the rural conservation, but I guess don't want to assume that it is going to match it exactly.
Continue. Yep. Anything online? There you go. Okay. Let's go to the next one.
Okay. So we did a little case study, not little, we did a big case study of Addison, Vermont. We happen to be working with Addison right now on their plan update. So there are not a little bit of a guinea pig, but and they start with A, so we thought we'd start with Addison. And so just to walk you through this, in many ways, it's a pretty simple process. This is their existing land use area map in their existing town plan now that we're updating. So you can see their conservation area. This is what they did. We probably mapped it for them, but this is the designations that they created. The bright green is a conservation area. Most of the map is a low density residential / agricultural area. They have along the shore what they call a shoreland residential area, and they also have a shoreline recreation area. And then they have their village neighborhood commercial area. Now, Addison does have a village center designation, but it's not in there. It's much smaller within that. They also show their flood hazard overlay, which is basically Dead Creek and the creeks in the southeast and west corner. So this is, this is what they have. You can go to the next slide. This is what Addison Regional Planning Commission has in their regional plan. And it's basically, this is what we had before. This is not a new map. This is what our existing land use map for this town is. And just at first glance, it looks pretty similar. Except for the breakdown along the shore. So you can go to the next slide. This is the map that we developed, that Hannah, our GIS staff developed with the methodology that was taken from the statutes of the spell from Act 181. And overall, it's not that much different. I mean, in terms, the big difference that we see is that we are looking at that the residential shoreline area and the shoreline recreational area are combined, and we're calling it a recreation-based area. The conservation area is pretty much aligned. The low, what were they called? I can't remember now what it was called. Low density ag area is broken down into a rural ag and forest and a rural general. And I believe that distinction is made due to current use. Is that correct?
Most of it, yes.
Yeah. And then you can see the village area. It's actually not that much larger than what they were calling their village area. But it is based on the village center designation and with this quarter mile, starting kind of with a quarter mile radius, but then looking at the parcels and how that should be refined around there. We haven't got into the details of we haven't sat down and really looked at that village area with the town. We've just talked about it in general about mapping this way. So if their select board says, yeah, we'll opt in to this, we think this is a good idea, we'll work this into our regional plan, we'll fine tune it with them. And then when we finish our regional map with all the communities, they would have the ability to have that Act 250 exemption in that village area, village center area. Good, yeah. So our next steps are basically to make sure that all of our communities understand this process, which seems to be the biggest task. And that, we are able to provide any kind of information on this to anybody who wants it. To work with each municipality, as we've said before, to help them understand their land use plan, help them understand what we're doing, what the region is doing, and to, develop that future land use map. And bullet 3 is foster a collaborative environment to build community consensus on the regional future land use map. Why do I have that on there? I'm wondering. I've debated taking it out, but sounds good. And Fred Kenny has his hand up. So, up next slide is the question slide.
There you go.
All right. Fred?
I don't know if you can go back to the Addison slide. Yeah, so first, quickly, what's PGA?
PGA is planned growth area. That
Okay.
would be similar to a village area, but but it would have to have infrastructure. It would have to have septic and complete streets.
Right, so there isn't one that on this
No.
map.
No,
So the only place that housing would be allowed without going through Act 250, according to this map in Addison, is in that purple village center, right?
no.
Say what?
No, it would,
No.
now the Purple Village Center, housing would be allowed there. It's the pink zone, the
Mhm.
light pink zone. It would be exempt for 50 units on 10 acres, up to 50
Okay.
units on 10 acres. And you could have housing in any place you can have housing now, as long as it doesn't trigger the status quo Act 250. I mean, you could still have that too.
Right.
I mean, you just have to go through that permit. You can still
Go
have
through Act
housing.
250, yeah.
The
Okay.
only exemption in this map is that light
The
pink
pink
area.
area. Okay. And that's still subject to local zoning and approval.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Questions?
Wonder if you could say more about like in the next steps of working with with municipalities, like what are some of the plans around community engagement? Like, are you leaving that up to towns? Is that something that you're gonna help lead? I'm just curious about like how you continue to build consensus.
Right, so that last slide said, as before I changed it, about a half hour before it said next steps, said Addison County Regional Planning's community engagement goals. So the basic goals are that we include all the people, all community members as best we can. We're gonna go and when we go to each town, we'll do outreach to get as many people to come as we can. We're gonna actually try to get the town itself to work on that as well. It,
Can I try?
yes,
Yeah.
you can try.
I will. So, we are gonna go out to all the towns first. We wanna make sure that your planning commissions are on board with whatever we develop. So we think it's really important to make sure that we work with them collaboratively to help build our regional plan. So we're gonna do it one town at a time. Once we get that done, in addition to working with your planning commissions, we're gonna go out to the broader community. So we'll have a lot more, what I call kind of regional, outreach with a full plan as opposed to just one town showing.
And can you refresh to what's the timeline for like this next sort of chunk of work?
So we're gonna try and get out to every town within the next 3-4 months and maybe more than once to some towns. So Katie and Danelle and Rebecca and myself are gonna divide towns up and basically make sure that we can all get out to your planning commissions. We're gonna do it through your regular planning commission public hearings, and we will ask your planning commissions to, advertise it or share it broadly. We will also share it on our website. So we'll get out there. It's gonna take us a little bit to reach some consensus, I imagine, on all these areas with each of the towns. So, we're hoping we will have a regional land use map built summer, fall that we'll be taking out to the larger community. And then we are hoping to bring our plan to the land use review board right around December is what I've got on our calendar. Basically because they're going to need a review process as well. So the land use review board will approve our entire plan. Our goal is to have our entire plan done before July 2026, when our current plan expires.
And the review of the regional plan is a warned public
hearing as
hearing.
well.
And it's like a 60-day, isn't it? Or
Yes.
are you prioritizing, or how are you prioritizing the towns?
Well, we are actually, there's a lot of towns right now that are in the process of getting updated or applying for municipal planning grants to get updated in the next year or so. So we haven't quite figured, so those are sort of the obvious ones because we're going to be going out to work with them. But other towns, like I know New Haven just did its plan update. How we, work with that, we don't know. We have to also, who is going to be able to meet with us too? So it's not really, it's kind of going to be a give and take.
There isn't a priority given to people who have requested grants for updating, for your assistance in updating town plans?
Not necessarily. We're gonna be going out to those towns anyways, so we have the, but I know there's, yeah,
We haven't
kinda-
really put it together yet.
Yeah.
Like I said, Danelle and Katie and Rebecca and myself, so we've gonna put a lot of our staff behind this, a lot of our team behind this to go out and make sure we can get out to everybody, within the next couple of months. Our bottleneck is really redoing the mapping and bringing you a draft to start with. Hannah can only do so many at a time, so we are gonna have to stagger it a little bit. Invite us, if you want us there early,
Right.
if you wanna be on the table early, reach out to Katie or Danelle.
And I mean, you're in the process, so you're a prime candidate to go visit.
We'd love to see that map now.
Yeah, so we'll make, so I think that after this, this initial kickoff that we are gonna reach out and, it's hard to get meetings. It's hard to figure out times when communities have the ability to meet with us, so.
We've already done the inventory of every municipality's planning commission and DRB meetings, just so that we have an idea of when things are happening. And most obviously meet Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. So that's, as far as there's a little bit of conflict there, here and there. But again, we've already run that, so we know when you're scheduled to meet. And some meet every other month. So, some are meeting twice a month, some meet every other month. So there's those variables to look at too.
Anybody else? Anybody online? Herb?
We'll just view them.
Yeah, were you calling him? So, I think you were calling him. So couple of things. First, real big shout out to Adam and Katie in terms of making this presentation. I think it's really coherent. It lays things out really well. There are two things going on here at the same time. The legislature passed this Act 191 that is going to require, implementation. And that's what Katie and Adam are talking about, reaching out to each municipality and figuring out, how to implement this thing. There are going to be some interesting conversations around implementation. But I'm really convinced that the Regional Planning Commission is going to do a real good job around that. The second issue, I think, was alluded to in a few of the slides here, which is, what the issues are in terms of housing in our county. I'll just speak for myself in my little neck of the woods, but we got a real big housing problem here. And so how do we get more housing so that people, young families, whatever, where employers can actually, find housing for the people that they want to hire and stuff. And the slides, I think, were really good in terms of, the magnitude of the problem. And I think it demonstrates that the Planning Commission is really, gonna try to help municipalities with get over that hump too. So I'm really encouraged about that.
Thanks, Herb.
I have a excuse me. I have a question. Where is the link to download this handout that you mentioned at the beginning?
In the chat.
Okay.
Can't find it, I can email it.
Yeah, Sharon, I recognize your voice. If you can't if you have trouble with that, just give me an email and we'll get it to you.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any link. Thanks.
Okay, she'll share it again.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. What? Oh, asked Anna.
I have to click it there. Oh, let's do it.
Hi, Anna, can you, yeah, you can, you're muted. How do we unmute Anna? There's a
She has to
question.
unmute herself, like the rest of the folks might have.
Oh,
Hey, Anna, could you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. What did you?
Okay, did you have a question?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
I was trying to find the link on the chat myself.
It might
I
be-
actually found it. It's all the way down at the bottom.
Yeah, probably the first thing that was posted before our technical difficulties.
It again, and we will post it on the website as well.
Susan?
Is there a timeline for the disaggregation of the housing numbers?
Oh, I don't know. Yes, there is.
Yeah, we're gonna have to get that to you before, we come to any agreement on basically your future land use area. We have not done the work on that yet, so I really don't have any idea. The numbers, though, if you look at the low and the high for Addison County for the next 5 years, we're 1,200 to 1,800. There are 200 new units going in Middlebury in the Stonecrop development right here. So I was actually surprised a little bit on how low they were, and I think being able to I don't think we're gonna shock anybody. We wanna look at the sewer capacities of Virgins and Middlebury in particular, and also Orwell Shoreham. We want to look at basically the size of the areas that will be your village areas, and look at some of your zoning and figure it out and do as good a job as we can at allocating these numbers as fairly and realistically as we can. And we haven't done that. And, each of the towns will be able to say, hey, what, you're giving us that much, or we want some more. We think we can do more with it. And it's gonna be a fluid conversation for a little bit. I would tell you, I'd like to get to the final housing numbers when we get to the final regional map, which I said was sometime in the summer.
Right, and there are some different methods that people have been looking at across the state. And so we've been talking to other regional planning commissions, and that's how they're figuring that, the de-aggregation of these numbers and different sort of ways to look at the different communities. And I just heard today, like someone had, sort of allocated all the numbers, and they're like, oh, there's so much space in this one town. But then they realized, well, they don't have any capacity, any infrastructure. So that just changed everything, because there might be a lot of great places to put housing, but if you can't support them with any kind of infrastructure, it doesn't make sense. And then there's also the question of what type of housing it is as well. So it's a pretty complicated process. And it's not as if we're gonna say, oh, New Haven has to do this many and you get penalized if you don't. It has to make sense. It's something that has to make sense for all communities. Anything else?
Yeah, this might be kind of random. I'm just trying to think about the breakdown of the rural designations, like the rural terminology. Knowing that there's one chunk of it that's tier 3, there's no guidelines on that yet. I'm curious where, when we're talking about critical natural resources, are we including prime agricultural soils in that, or is that in a different part of rural, like agroforest or?
I think that's in a different part of rural. That's
Yes.
in the rural and forestry. That's like working landscape, working farms is in that ag and forest breakdown.
So if you want to go back to the Addison map,
Addison
Which
map,
one?
Down.
the newest one that we just.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
that's second up the last slide.
Okay, did I miss it?
No, keep going.
The last
keep going
slide.
down. Next one.
That
There we
one.
go.
Right there. So I'll call it teal. Teal green is largely, this is Addison, it's relatively flat. Those are largely agricultural, either they're agricultural easements or they are land in current use. And most of that is agriculture. There might be some forest areas in there. The rural general is the gold, I'll call it. You know, you can see it's smaller lots generally, whereas the teal, the ag lots are big lots still.
Especially adjacent to roads, because they're usually abutting a development of some kind, housing development or.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then you can see the rural conservation is the green. That's gonna be similar. That's it's not gonna be exactly tier 3. Not everything in there will be tier 3. Or tier 3 may expand a little bit beyond it. We don't know the rules yet, but it's a relatively close approximation. That works for the town of Addison. When you get up into, say, the town of Starksboro or the town of Ripton, that are, you know, 90% forested, we're gonna have to take a much closer look at that, because you'll see a lot of it is forestry. So we've got some learning to do as they develop those rules too.
Can I just get like a related question? When you're doing this mapping system and you're thinking about like rural ag and forest, are like you interacting with like soil maps at all? I'm just thinking about like Addison County has some of the best agricultural soils in the state. And so it's like, how are these maps taking into account the preservation of that if it's not already conserved?
So all of the rural areas are, well, some of the conservation areas in and around there will be tier 3, and those will be subject to more Act 250 scrutiny. The tier 2 lands, which is most of the land in the town of Addison there, are still subject to Act 250, and Act 250 still has that criteria 9B, which is the agricultural and soils component of it. So it's not going away.
Sure, it's just the exemption areas.
So the exemption areas for housing, so in this case, it's the pink area. You know, which if you can visualize the village of Addison, it's more than just the dark purple area, which was their village center area. You couldn't fit much housing in there, but if you think of the Addison school, and you think of the septic that they have behind there, and that zone actually reflects that planning area actually reflects the planning area largely that they had developed in their current plan. So what we're hoping this will do, one of the real benefits of this is to, when you think of your village, will get your village into the tier 1B. You can opt in, but that's what I think we're trying to map. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it does.
It's kind of going back to that major planning goal, state planning goal, to try to like focus that development there as opposed to spread out.
It doesn't mean that people can't build a house in the rural area, but they'll still be, depending on the number that they build, they'd still be subject to Act 250.
Sure.
Right, it's just a mechanism to enable.
No, I understand,
Development.
but like, for example, I'm thinking of the town of Millbury, has like prime ag soils that would be within this expanded buffer zone. And so I'm just thinking about like how those different pieces might interact as these plans are being developed, because it's not like all of the great ag land is outside of town.
Right.
And you could argue that there's a benefit to having ag land within those buffer zones, because that increases access to markets, easier for people to find housing if they're working on farms, like all of those reasons. So just like thinking about those pieces.
But then that brings in that conversation of, you still have Middlebury reviewing their DRB and their zoning. So you have, because they're now making local decisions about that.
Sure.
So just because it's allowed and you're not gonna have Act 250 permit for a certain, doesn't mean that it's just gonna happen. Because
No,
you're
I
just,
understand. I
yeah.
think it's more, I'm thinking along the lines of like, there was an earlier question about like, when you opt in,
Mhm.
you know, like what gets lost when when like an area becomes exempt. And so.
Yeah, I don't see anything, I mean, I guess it's a different perspective, but I think it's more of a gain than a loss. It's just possibilities, but that doesn't mean those possibilities are just gonna automatically happen.
I understand.
Yeah. Tom?
I just wanted to mention also there are provisions within the law, within the rural districts in particular, not so much the conservation, but rural ag and forest and rural general. And, you know, within certain towns, it was mentioned that there might be a need to move some of the rural ag and forest into rural general to make more housing possible. And there's a methodology for doing that. Or the law is intending, at least, for there to be a methodology. I don't know if it's been developed yet.
I'm not familiar with that.
And also for moving rural general into tier 1B, if it seems useful or necessary, or people really want it.
That's the equitable impact portion of the
Oh,
law
okay.
is what I would say. So you're right. And again, if you've got a town like Starksboro or a town like Ripton that are 90+% forested, you're not gonna necessarily move the whole town into tier 3. You know, that unproportionately burdens those towns. So there is some mechanism to move things around a little bit more. We have not worked out the details on that. And again, since they haven't worked out the tier 3 guidance, we're not sure where things are gonna fall.
Questions
Yes, question?
from the field?
Any questions out there?
Well, actually, I have one. What about the possibility of some mechanism that you can take conservation lands and trade them? Because in Bridport, we have some areas of conservation land that it was sort of a poor decision that was made a long time ago, and it really should be included in part of the village area. And there's other property in the town that could go under conservation and in a trade kind of thing. But to have to buy that out of conservation would be prohibitively expensive. You know, and particularly if you're talking about land that the town owns.
Okay. So that's not necessarily a zoning or an Act 250 issue. That's more of an issue between the town and whoever owns basically the conservation rights on the property that you're talking about. And the terms under which those conservation rights were put into it. If somebody, you know, basically willed the land to the conservation and the conservation entity and said, you know, I'll give you this land so long as you keep it basically as open space and conserve it, then they're probably not going to be very flexible. But they may also have some flexibility. It's going to really matter how the land was conserved and how the body that owns those conservation rights feels about swapping them out. So different discussion, but a worthwhile discussion potentially.
Thanks,
Well,
Sharon.
it just seems like places that have a lot of property under conservation that it becomes a challenge when some areas that were conserved mostly for tax purposes that are areas that are better for development and areas that should be conserved because of either soil types or forest or continuous forest areas, things like that. That perhaps there should be some reorganization of that aspect going on in this
It's
whole
a good
process.
question to ask, Sharon. If you look at, for example, just this town of Addison map that we have up, and I would tell you that probably Bridport and Ferrisburg and Panton and Shoreham and Orwell are all very similar. There's a lot of land in that rural ag and forestry that's that has either conservation easements on it or is in the current use program and can't be developed. And yeah, that does constrain, you know, some things that you can do in those towns. So it might be a good conversation for the town to have with some of the conservation entities, specifically if you have a couple parcels in mind.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. How we
Hearing
doing?
no questions.
How we doing? It's 7:29. Anyone else out there, or are we all set? I think we're all set. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all for your
Thanks.
technological
Yeah.
heroics and overcoming adversity.
Did we?
I don't know.
There was a point I didn't think it was gonna happen.
Another meeting.
So thank you all for coming. We really
You gotta
appreciate
put
it.
Yeah,
your
thank you.
computer
And we
under
look
your
forward to
Christmas
this
tree.
conversation.
No.
Oh, you got a new.
I don't think it's this. I don't know.
I use a Mac.
It's just,
Hard to-
it happens to everyone. Like, and then we were sorry. It's evil.
And please take some cookies or some soda or something.
No one